thank you so much for being with us this morning. You've seen the news overnight. The Homeland Security Inspector General put out this statement saying that text messages from January 5th and 6th were destroyed after the IG asked for them. How does that look to you?
Morning, John. It doesn't look very good, but when you sort of dig a little bit deeper into it, it becomes even murkier. The Secret Service, I think, put out a statement saying that none of the things that the committee was interested in were destroyed. Also said it was part of an ordinary transition from old phones to new phones. And the Inspector General is actually the guy that was appointed by Trump. And the person running the Department of Homeland Security was under the Biden administration. So it's very confusing. It may well be that there's something here that's completely normal. It may be something else, but I think it's too early to probably jump to conclusions. It is yet just another sort of head scratching moment regarding January 6th, however.
Sure, there is so much we don't know here, but it is interesting that it was a Trump appointed inspector general making this request and informing people that these pieces of information were destroyed after the request. Why would the Secret Service be uncomfortable? We've seen it in other examples too, with full disclosure or full discussions with what happened or their role on January 6th.
Yeah, I don't know if they're uncomfortable. Keep in mind, as soon as Cassidy Hutchinson testified, the U.S. Secret Service was very quick to say they would be providing testimony under oath that would counter some of the allegations that she made. They've made it very clear that they've been cooperating with the January 6th committee from the very beginning. I've not heard anything different up until now, I guess, from the committee, suggesting that the U.S. Secret Service has been anything but fully forthcoming. Yeah, they've got secret in their name. But the fact of the matter is, and I've worked with them for 4 years, I had a Secret Service detail for about a year and a half. Some of the most honorable and upright people in the federal government end up sort of being attracted to this agency. So I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt at this point. They said they testified to Congress twice under oath that part of what the Inspector General was saying is not entirely accurate. So again, too early to jump to conclusions. I'm inclined to believe the Secret Service on this one, but we'll see what happens as the committee digs a little bit deeper.
You know, it is interesting because also in the last few hours or 12 hours or so, CNN has heard that a D.C. Metro police officer corroborated the version of events described by Cassidy Hutchinson that she heard took place on the morning of January 6th, where Donald Trump was in the limousine trying to go to the Capitol. A D.C. Metro police officer corroborated the version of events. I don't know if the specific details about lunging for the wheel or choking, but what's the important takeaway from that event, from the former president wanting to go to the Capitol?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it's important to remember that Cassidy said she heard this from someone else who heard it from someone else. It was secondhand or second level hearsay. I don't really care if the president lunged at the wheel or assaulted his Secret Service agent, although the latter is a crime. But in the greater scheme of things, the real issue is what was his reaction when he was told that he couldn't go to the Capitol? Whether or not he grabbed the wheel or grabbed a person, was he really, really angry? Did he fly into a rage over that? I think there could be some evidence coming out to that effect. That to me is much more important. His emotional reaction, his immediate response to not being allowed to go down to the Capitol on that day, to my mind, speaks a lot more to his state of mind than whether or not he actually grabbed the wheel or grabbed his Secret Service agent.
And the fact that he wanted to be at the Capitol. To do what, do you think?
Well, and that's what this whole thing is becoming about, right? I tried to figure out when these hearings started what the plan was, and I think I see a theme now, which is that everybody sort of acknowledges that what the Proud Boys did and the Oath Keepers did was a crime. In fact, many of them have pled guilty to crimes. And what it looks like the committee is trying to do is draw a line between what those groups did that is criminal and the White House or even the president himself. And if the president was in the Secret Service, was in the limousine, and really, really wanted to go down to lead this effort, it might lead to more evidence that he was involved with some of the planning for it. Personally, I don't think that's what Donald Trump does. He's not a long-term planner, but it will be curious to see if Mr. Bannon testifies, if Mr. Navarro testifies, if Mr. Meadows testifies as to whether or not there was communication directly between those right-wing extremist groups and folks in that Trump inner circle.
Have they raised enough questions, the committee? And I know you've been watching them very carefully, and you've written about watching them, and you think it's important that people watch them, including Republicans. Have enough questions been raised, do you think, in public that you think the Department of Justice should be investigating?
Well, the Department of Justice doesn't should they investigate? Yes. The question I usually get is should they bring charges? And it's way too early to jump to that conclusion. Keep in mind, much of the evidence that's being presented at the hearing would never be allowed in court. Might be allowed in a grand jury, but hearsay evidence would never
Mm.
be allowed in court. The DOJ is much more serious. If they're going to charge a president of the United States or this inner circle, they're going to have to take it very, very seriously. The political investigation that's going on now is at an entirely different level. So I encourage people to sort of take it with a grain of salt what they're seeing coming out of the committee. But certainly, I have a lot of questions. I defended the president for almost a year, saying that I really did believe that the speech didn't lead to the riot, that it was another one of those ad lib things that Donald Trump did that sort of got out of hand, and he wasn't involved in any planning at all. I think Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony, especially that the president knew there were guns with the protesters, and that there may have been direct communications between the inside of the Oval, the West Wing, and those right wing groups, sort of caused me to step back and say, okay, wait a second, let's find more out about this, and that's sort of where I am. And I think a lot of folks, including many Republicans, are in the same boat.
Also, the insinuations about possible witness tampering, I know you think these are important. CNN has reported that the phone call that Donald Trump placed was to a White House support staff member who does not normally hear from Donald Trump. Why is that important?
Yeah, that one got my scratching my head a little bit because I sort of know the people in that universe. At least I did when I worked in the West Wing, and these would be folks like the stewards. And it was supposedly it was related to some of Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony. And one of the things she said that would have taken place in the back hallways of the West Wing were the incident about the throwing of plates or the throwing of lunch or the pulling of the tablecloth off the table. The stewards would see that. The stewards are not typically in communication with the President of the United States, but at the same time, CNN was also reporting that the person who got the phone call from the president was so alerted to it that they called his or her lawyer. I can't imagine the stewards would have a lawyer. So I'm not sure who the universe of people would be in that circumstance. I'd be curious to see if the committee does actually have the evidence. I assume they did, or else it would be responsible for Liz Cheney to mention it. But it's just another thing that we need to wait to see what happens before we jump to any conclusions.
So I want to ask you, because Olivia Nuzzi interviewed Donald Trump, who told her at this point, it's not a matter so much of if he runs for president again, but as he puts it, I would say my big decision will be whether I go before or after, seemingly to refer to the midterms. Do I go before or after? That's my big decision. What happens if he goes before the midterms?
The midterms become about him, by the way, at least a little bit. All politics is still local, and if you're still worried about paying $5 of gas, in rural Illinois, that's going to drive your decision making a lot more than whether or not President Trump has already announced to run in 2024. So I don't put that much sort of weight on the president's impact on the midterms, but it could certainly have some impact in some districts. I think the real irony here, John, is that if part of the committee's purpose was to damage Donald Trump to where he wouldn't run or would discourage him from running, it's actually having the exact opposite impact. I think Donald Trump wants to be able to tell his side of the story. He feels like he's not being represented at the committee, and that he will choose to get that higher, that larger podium, that larger platform as a candidate, and announce earlier rather than later.
You told my friend Casey Hunt that you would support a lot of people before you supported Donald Trump for the Republican nomination. Do you hope he doesn't run?
Yeah, I do. I just think it's better for the party. I look around and I look at folks like Ron DeSantis and Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, go down the list, Tim Scott, Nikki Haley. There's a lot of folks that the Republicans can vote for that get the same policies and the same sort of willingness to stand up and fight for the middle class that Donald Trump had without the baggage. And I think that's important. It's important in the House. It's important to the Senate. I think you get a lot of the benefits without a lot of the drawbacks. So, yeah, I think that's where a lot of Republicans are as a direct result of these hearings.
I do want to ask you, your former colleague in the White House, John Bolton, who was National Security Advisor when you were the acting chief of staff, he was speaking to Jake Tapper the other day, and he was talking about, he didn't like the formulation that some people use that Donald Trump was attempting a coup on January 6th. And this was the exchange that he had with Jake. Listen.
One doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup.
I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work, and that's not what he did. It was just stumbling around from one idea to another, ultimately, he did unleash the rioters at the Capitol. As to that, there's no doubt. But not to overthrow the Constitution, to buy more time to throw the matter back to the states to try and redo the issue.
Raised a whole lot of eyebrows as someone who has helped plan coup d'etats. What do you think?
There's two different pieces and parts of that. Let's deal with the president first, which is, I think John's probably right. The president was he's not a chess player. He's not sort of moving pieces across a chessboard in a grand plan to overthrow the government. I think John's take there could be accurate, and the president was doing something. It could still be illegal, by the way, to try and buy time. So that strikes me as somewhat accurate. On the part about John Bolton planning coups, listen, I worked with John. I think very famously, John and I didn't get along very well. It doesn't surprise me that John is sort of pumping himself up. He likes to sell books, but I don't put much weight in his version of his planning coup d'etat overseas. I'm more interested in what he had to say about January 6th.
Mick Mulvaney, thank you for joining us on New Day. Appreciate it.
Thanks, John.